Yes, I just give you a quick update. We had a Healthy Start initiative that we started, and basically back July the 1st is what was dated at. We had a few hiccups on the initialization of it. We had to change some of the thought processes that we were dealing with from the county level. And if you're familiar with this particular grant, it's a grant from HRSA for $15 million to Genesee County, and we do have 5 specific named partners in the process. Those named partners include Genesee County Health Department, Greater Flint Health Coalition, Michigan State University Hurley Pediatric Public Health Initiative, Genesee Health Systems, Genesee Intermediate School District, and City of Flint. Through a series of meetings that we've had, we've also identified another partner in the process of Priority Children, and they will be added to the proposed work plan here. The aims of this process is to identify the cohort children involved in this, assess those children's receipt of recommended services to minimize developmental delays, assist cohort children with enrollment in Medicaid and WIC and developmental screening programs. For a subset of the cohort children with blood levels higher than 5 parts, we're providing developmental assessments and engage with home visitation and case management services. Evaluate, address, recruit, and retention of providers of those services to assist families of cohort children with connections to services and support to minimize developmental delays in the children, and to coordinate community partner collaboration and systems integration to maintain ongoing engagement and follow-up of the cohort families. To date, we've had several meetings in order to try to address working with our partners here. We have a new interim health director at our department. We've been reaching out to our partners, and I think we've developed a pretty good relationship at this point in time and have a good plan going forward on this. And it really, I guess I would ask two of our partners seated here, Dr. Mohana, Tisha, and Dr. Pugh, if you guys are satisfied with the movement we have at this point in time in the direction, because this is a partnership. This is not just about Genesee County. This is a partnership, and as commissioners, Commissioner Nolden, myself, as well as the whole Board of Commissioners, we have committed to making sure that this moves forward. And I think our partners will also address to you that we have had a very active role in comparison to what has happened in the past.
Dr. Tisha, you want to?
Yeah, I would just applaud the commissioners, the two of you guys especially, for taking the lead and steering this in the right direction. This is a huge grant. It's a $15 million grant that was part of that Flint bill that passed Congress that had the money for the infrastructure. And I think it's finally at a place where there's collaboration from the community, and it will not be redundant to the other services in the community, but will only strengthen them. The Healthy Start is a national initiative that seeks to reduce disparities in pregnant moms and children up to the age of 5. So it's something that we definitely need in this community. Thank you.
Dr. Pugh, you want to make a comment?
I would just agree with Dr. Monahana, Tisha, as well as you all, and applaud you for being inclusive and putting a pause in the way that the plan was moving forward and really taking our perspectives into consideration. And this funding that was received was one of the pots of funding that we received through the federal government that did not have to come to Flint, that was open to any community in the United States. So we're happy that the funding did make it here and that we are looking at it from a community perspective.
Any other questions for Chairman Young? Seeing none, Captain Kalinsky, it's on you.
Thank you, Harvey. Good morning, everybody. Just a couple of quick updates from our last meeting. First, on the timeline of the community points of distribution, as far as them closing. Back August 11th, CPODs 2 and 3 closed. September 5th, CPODs 5, 7, and 8 closed. Then September 18th, the state operation of the remaining C pods 1, 4, 6, and 9 ended. I believe at the city, I think it's Jamaica Patrick Singleton is the point of contact now for the city on that. And then on October 9th, the state warehouse lease ended and things were transitioned over to the food bank, who are handling this component of the mission. A little bit different how they're doing it, because this is what they do. They understand just-in-time delivery and things of that nature. So they've taken that on. The state still is assisting when needed. We're still providing like the mobile minis. Those are the those little housing or shacks, if you will, at the points of distribution that provide shelter, heat, air conditioning, as well as cones, tables, the iPads, chairs, signs. So all the equipment that we had with the points of distribution, we still have available. And that stuff is still in the field, and we'll work with the city once we get to the point of turning all that back in. There's, as I mentioned, four CPODs, Ward 1, 4, 6, and 9. My understanding is they allow 8 cases of water per customer per day. And from the data that I've seen, it looks like about 500 pallets of water are going out a week. As I've said in the past, this fluctuates, so just be aware of that. And the hours are still Monday through Saturday, I believe noon to 6. The coalition, the Water Coalition, I don't know if I said this date, on September 20th, state operation of the door-to-door deliveries and the school deliveries ended, and that's the state overseeing piece of it. But the Water Coalition is still in place, delivering to the schools, the charter schools, and the other schools that are in place. And there's a schedule as to when they deliver, and they're working direct with those schools and with the food bank. And I think, Harvey, that's really all the updates I have on this, unless somebody has any questions. Dr. Reynolds?
Yeah, I need a clarification about who's distributing filters and who's distributing test kits. Because in the past, the pods had both those services available?
Yes, so the test kits ended at the pods quite a while ago. But I was just looking, I had a bullet on this, that the pods are still providing the filters and the water and the replacement cartridges. I was just trying to double check that. Okay, thank you. That's correct.
Yeah, Captain, if I could,
Yes, sir.
George will provide that as part of his update also.
Okay, thanks, Keith.
Seeing none, Dr. Pugh.
Just some for clarification purposes. So Jamaica Patrick Singleton is the facilitator. She's the person that's helping to facilitate this, and we just have to be clear, because she's funded through funding, that this can't be her sole focus. So I just want to clarify that. And they are doing focus groups throughout the city where they're collecting information from residents on how they're seeing this process transition, and we want to use that information to be able to feed it back to the state to speak to what the needs are. One of the things that we did see an increase in, and we weren't necessarily surprised, is the home delivery, is that number was shooting up as far as residents who were calling and needing home delivery, and that's because they were able to get, or our thought is that they were able to get the water because it might have been closer to home, or they might have been able to find it at a place of worship, and some of those places are no longer in place. So we want to reassess this. We're going to be bringing some of that information to our technical advisory board this coming Monday, and talking that through, but we also want to use this focus group information to be able to better articulate, what we are seeing, what the patterns are now that we've had this switch and moving this back to the city, or to the city.
Thank you, Dr. Pugh.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to the water quality update. There are a number of reports on this, so I'll just kick it over to Keith.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield my time to George. It really is an integrated approach between some of the core activities, some of the sampling activities, some of the sampling activities after lead service lines are removed. So I'll punt very quickly to George and then be ready for any questions.
Thank you, Director. So, Stacy, could you get that first slide up, please? So what I would like to discuss this morning is providing an update regarding all of the various water testing efforts that we have ongoing, as well as some of the core initiatives, and give you an update on those particular activities. There's a lot of information to cover here, so I'll try and squeeze all of this into the time allotted, but there's a lot going on. Stacy, if you could, please, thank you. Just as a retrospective to remind everyone, because we really have had a lot of activities going on, we originally started off with what we called the 5 prongs of testing. So we had the residential testing, which is still ongoing and still available to any resident to get their water tested free of charge. We then also incorporated schools testing, and schools is kind of a generic term because really it's very inclusive of a broad range of facilities that have at-risk populations. So it would be the Flint Community Schools, the charters, the parochials, the daycare centers, the elder care facilities. So there's a number of different facilities that fall under that banner, so that's kind of just a generic term. Then there was the food services testing protocols that were implemented in conjunction with our friends over at MDARD, and that was just to ensure that the water that was being provided at all of the various food establishments was of a known quality. Then the elevated blood lead level investigations that have been offered to residents, and that's been done through our partners over at HHS. And then, as many of you know, we've also done the sentinel testing, which began back in 2016 and was an ongoing effort, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. Next slide. We've also had a whole lot of additional efforts that I want to touch on just very briefly. We've had our high lead visit program, where anytime a resident had a water value above 100 parts per billion, we made sure that we did outreach to those residents to ensure that they were aware of all the precautionary measures they needed to implement in order to keep themselves safe. We've got the CLEAR program, which is confirming lead elimination after replacement, and I'll be discussing that in depth here momentarily. The CORE program, which is community outreach and resident education, which has been a very successful program. And one of the key components of that program is that it's been so successful because we're utilizing residents to provide outreach to fellow residents. So that's really created a whole level of trust there since these are community members that are doing this outreach. We've also had our fixture replacement program, and this was open to any resident that met one of 3 different criteria. One, if they had had a lead result greater than 15 parts per billion, either in their 1 liter bottle or a 1 liter calculated value. They were also eligible if they had a faucet that was not compatible with the point of use filters that we were providing, and also if a resident had leaky or broken plumbing. We also incorporated them into the program. And so far, we've been able to provide replacement fixtures to residents at over 3,200 different homes in the city. Then we've had our focused residential testing outreach that I'll talk about. Basically, in our conversations with community groups, they wanted us to be able to do a focused outreach to those folks that have not submitted a water test, and so I'll talk about that. And then there's the LCR compliance monitoring that we've been doing as well, and I'll be talking about that as well. Stacy? So with respect to the core efforts to date, This started as a pilot program in August of 2016. The original goal of this was to have 36 team members, and the reason we came up with 36 was with there being 9 wards, we figured if we had 2 teams of 2 in each ward canvassing those wards on a daily basis, that would be a good thing. We then realized that we needed to ramp up those efforts, and we actually expanded that out to 160 members. And to date, we've knocked on over 434,000 doors, and that has resulted in over 137,000 conversations with residents. So this has just been an outstanding effort, and it's been a very well-received program. Stacy? And I got to tell you, we are very persistent in making sure that we provide outreach to every resident. Basically, in April of 2017, we did a data poll because we knew we were knocking on every single door in the city, but the question was, who haven't we actually spoken to? So we did a data poll. And when we did, it showed that there were 4,695 homes with where we have not had a conversation with a resident. And so we started having a focused effort on those 4,695 residences to make sure that we did have a conversation. And so I'm very happy to tell you that as of November 30th, there are only 136 active water accounts where we have not had a conversation. And I can tell you that at those 136 addresses, we've knocked on their door an average of 43 times each. So, you know, we have been really trying hard to make sure that we reach everyone. Now, I know that earlier on, there was some concern as to whether or not there was some geographic disparity with respect to who we're not communicating with, whether it be the undocumented population or whatever. So we started tracking very carefully by ward where we have not had conversations. So if you look at that chart in the lower right-hand corner, that shows you the ward number and the number of residences where we have not had a conversation. So you can see that this is spread across all 9 of the wards. 7 and 8 have the most number of residences where we haven't had a conversation. But like I said, in total, we're looking at less than 0.5% where we have not had at least one successful conversation with a resident. Stacy? So that brings us now. Okay.
Dr. Sullivan.
I just wonder, how do you define an active water account? Is
The city provides that to us.
But those are people who are paying their bill?
Those are people that have an active water account.
Right.
Whether or not they're in arrears is not part of the equation. Do they have an active water account?
Does that mean, do they have water, or does that, I mean, what does that mean? That's my question.
It means that they are on record with the city as having a water account.
So in these poorer neighborhoods, what I'm wondering is, if there are houses with water who haven't been visited because they're not listed as having an active water account. That's my question.
If they have water, then they would have an active water account.
Okay, then that goes to my earlier question. So having an active water account means they have water.
Yeah.
Does a home with water necessarily have an active water account?
We get these records from the city, so I can't speak to that level of
Right.
detail. What I can say is we are not taking into account how much they might be in arrears. That's not.
No,
part of
I
the-
know that. That's not what I'm pointing to. My concern is that in those poorer neighborhoods, there are residences that are getting water that don't have an active water account.
How would
And
they,
they're-
how would they get water if they didn't have an active water account?
George, if I can jump in, what an active water account means two things. They've got a water meter that's working. There's water going into the house, and they're paying something on their water bill. We don't ask them how much they pay. They just have to be paying on their water bill.
Is it possible with these concerns about people being able to turn on their water without paying a bill, without having it metered? Is there, or do we just not worry about residences that are able to access the water that don't have a water account?
So, Doctor, if I could jump in, if there's a body of knowledge that says that we need to knock on additional doors, please let us know. So within the universe that we're able to define,
Right.
George's team's out knocking on doors, but if there are those that you think need to be knocked on doors very specifically, see if you can't inform George in that conversation.
I don't have any specific information. I'm just worried that in these poorer wards, your numbers are low in part because they're, and I understand why you would only go to houses that have active water accounts, but I'm concerned about families with children whose water isn't being tested.
Yeah, and we certainly would share that concern. So if there is that,
Okay.
certainly continue to enhance the conversation.
If I can just ask a question, because so what we're talking about is if somebody's bypassing the water meter to get water, that's what because that's the only way they're going to get to not be an account is if they're not getting the water through the normal process of it going through a water meter.
Or the water meter isn't working.
Well, if the water meter, I mean, would we know if the water meter's working, but it's still an account with the water department, it just might not be working properly, but it still
Okay.
would be an
That-
account
that's-
is what I would.
That was the core of my question
Okay.
is when I asked what is an active water account, I was trying to determine whether or not there are people, families that are accessing the water, if it's possible, let's say, for families that are accessing water through theft or whatever, be able to access water from the city but don't have an active water account. I'm just concerned, and since we're out in the neighborhoods, that maybe there would be a way of identifying that.
Excuse me. I think one of the things that we might want to look at is if you're going door to door and they have active water accounts, but you find out that it's a residence where people are actually living in, but there might not be an active water accounts there, are we knocking on those doors too? Because there is ways to get around it. Because if they cut that the piece in the basement, then it won't register when they go by, and they can't steal the water. So I think that's probably one of the things we might want to look at. If you're on the street and it has active water on all of the houses, but maybe 2 or 3, but people are actually living in those houses, if you notice that, you might want to just knock on those doors also to rather be safe than sorry.
And I was going to say the other thing to address what you're asking about, Dr. Sullivan, is when we have Rob come and give us that information, because you were saying if they get around it through theft. Right, but he's going to give us that information, so that should give us an idea if we're missing some as well. So I think that's why it will be good to have him come and give us that report next time.
Okay, George?
Yeah. So moving on, the next item that we have is the focused residential testing outreach. So once again, we pulled our records, and approximately, when we did the data pull, approximately half of the current active water accounts have submitted at least one drinking water sample, and that is just a phenomenal response. In my anecdotal conversations with folks at the EPA and other researchers, the highest level that I've heard of before was when Washington, D.C. had their issue, and the number that I was given anecdotally was they had approximately 12% of their active water accounts submitting samples. So we thought, well, this is great. We're at around 50%, but can we do even better? So we then did a data poll to do a focused outreach to see if we could kind of canvass those homes that have not submitted a water sample and have a conversation with them, encouraging them to do so. So with respect to the efforts so far, and keep in mind that we only started this on November 3rd, we've had over 14,000 door knocks, and as of close of business on 11/29, we only had approximately 500 remaining, and I suspect that by the close of business today, we'll have knocked on every single door where they have not submitted a test. That's resulted in us having over 4,000 conversations with residents regarding getting their water tested. And from that, we have provided over 2,800 kits to residents who've agreed to test their water. And if you do the math, that leaves about 10,000 folks where we knocked on the door but didn't have a conversation. And we're going to be circling back around for another round to see how many of those 10,000 we might be able to have a conversation with. So we've had a very focused and deliberate program here to reach out to as many residents to get their water tested as possible. Stacy? Is it possible for the cameraman to move a little bit that way? Thank you. Thank you. So over here, this is a historical retrospective of the efforts with respect to the Sentinel program and the extended Sentinel program. If you look over there, this began way back in February of 2016, and we had 5 initial rounds of Sentinel testing that had well over 500 samples each. Not all of those were Tier 1 sites. This data up here on this chart just represents the Tier 1 sites in each of the rounds. And the red line right there represents the 90th percentile, and the blue line represents the percentage of samples in each of these Sentinel rounds that were at or below 15 parts per billion. So if you look at the chart, you can see that when we very first started this program, we were way down at 73.8%, and now for the last 10 rounds in a row, we've had results where the percentage of samples in each Sentinel round that were Tier 1 sites were above that 90% threshold. And it's pretty much stabilized out at about the 93-94% level. Stacy?
Have you looked at this with 10?
Dr. Tisha, could you use your mic, please? Thanks.
Have you looked at this with 10 parts per billion? Like if the action level was at 10 parts per billion, where would we be?
Well, what I can tell you, we'll be getting into the monitoring rounds, and I'll cover that a little bit later. I didn't break it down by each individual Sentinel round, but if you, when we start talking about the LCR monitoring, that'll become apparent. So I'll address that here very shortly. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the CLEAR program. This is the Confirming Lead Elimination After Replacement program. And what this was we wanted to see what impact removing the service line was going to have on lead levels in water. And so this began in April of 2017, and we had a little over 200 sites. There were 10 different zones throughout the city, so we took samplings from each of the 10 different zones, and the first round was prior to the service line being replaced. We then conducted 6 monthly rounds beginning in June of this year. So we went back to these same places and asked them to pull samples again, so that we could aggregate the data and see what kind of trend there was with respect to the lead levels at these places where the service lines were replaced. So the first thing that I want to mention is round one, where conducted this prior to replacement, easily met the requirements of the LCR. So in this population set, the 90th percentile value was 6 parts per billion. So, Dr. Mona, to address your question, that was definitely below the 10 part per billion proposed limit.
This was unfiltered, obviously.
This was unfiltered, absolutely. And so just some general observations. Even though we started out at 6 parts per billion, the system as a whole with this data set continued to improve. Now, given the fact that we started at 6 parts per billion, we needed to take a look at the data at a little bit more granular level so that we could better tease out what the improvement was. So not only did we chart this at the 90th percentile level, we also charted it at the 95th percentile level. And all that means is the 90th percentile value is the value at which 90% of the samples are at or below that number. Likewise, the 95th percentile value is simply that number where 95% of the samples are at or below that number. And this will make more sense in a minute. I've got some charts to show this out. We then also did some heat mapping by zip code. And when you see those slides, you'll see why heat mapping was important. There's a plethora of data there, and if you just look at it, it's a wall of numbers. So we applied certain flag criteria to that so that we could color code the cells so that you could just visually see by color the improvement rather than looking at numbers. And it's a much easier way to look at a large set of data. And then finally, I can tell you that in round 7, which just concluded, 100% of those samples were at or below 15 parts per billion. So that's really good news right there. So let's take a little deeper dive into this. If we look at the 90th percentiles for this data, and I want to put the caveat on here that round 1 was the only round where these could have been considered tier 1 sites. I fully acknowledge that, but the study was to see what kind of improvements that there were. You can see we went from 6 parts per billion in the first round down to 2 parts per billion in the last round. You can definitely see the improvement there, but Stacy, if you could go to the next slide, please. If you look at the 95th percentile, it shows the improvement a little bit better. So once you start looking at the 95th percentile, in round 1, that started at 14 parts per billion, and then it kept on dropping all the way down to 3 parts per billion. So what that means is in the last round, round 7, 95% of the samples were at or below 3 parts per billion. So that is indeed really good news. Next slide, please. So here's the heat mapping that I was talking about. And so what this does is create a visual representation of where in the city things might have been progressing a little bit slower. I want to reemphasize that when we started with a 6 part per billion 90th percentile value. So to measure an improvement when you're already starting at a good place is difficult to do unless you start getting a little bit more granular. So there were 5 different flags that we set. One was if the 90th percentile was greater than 10 parts per billion. And what this was, I should say this, is we broke this down by zip code. So we wanted to see if there was an area of the city that was lagging behind the others. So this is broken down by zip code. And so if any of these flags are tripped, the cell goes from white to yellow. Okay, so if the 90th percentile value was greater than 10 parts per billion in a particular zip code for that round, it would trip the flag. If the 95th percentile was greater than 15, or if the percentage of samples that were non-detect was less than 60%, or if the percentage of samples that were less than 5 parts per billion was less than 90%, or if the percentage of samples that were greater than 15 parts per billion was greater than 5, it would trip the flag. So if you look at round 1, you can see that there's quite a bit of yellow over there. And mind you, all of these criteria are not the LCR criteria. We basically raised the bar here quite a bit, and so I want to emphasize that. So starting off with, a pretty good situation, you can see there's a lot of yellow cells there. Then when you go to the second round, which is the first round after replacement, we had one zip code in particular, I think that's 06, that seemed to have some problems, or I should say was lagging behind the others. If you look at the data just from a LCR standpoint, it was still easily meeting it. And then the next round, round 3, you can see there's one red cell. I made that cell red because there was one sample in that particular round where there was a significant particulate release. That sample had a lead level a little bit higher than 3,000 parts per billion, and so I wanted to highlight that one in red. There was a definite particulate release right there, and so that's why that's highlighted in yellow. And then by the time we get to the 4th round, there was only one flag that was tripped. Next slide, please. And then if you look at this, rounds 5, 6, and 7, 3 rounds in a row, there were no flags that were tripped. So all of the zip codes for all of those remaining 3 rounds performed very well. And like I said at the beginning, 100% of the samples in round 7 were at or below 15 parts per billion. All right.
Dr. Atisha.
So before you get into the other stuff, George, this is awesome, and I think it really speaks to how the LCR is, as it is ridiculous. The LCR, as we all know, is not health-based. These action levels are based on feasibility, and when we know that there's no safe level of lead, and that with lead replacement we can drop our lead levels in water even greater, that's huge. And I think this is the information that should be driving both state and national policy to get the lead out of our infrastructure, and we're really leading the way. So this is great information that we can drop to levels of 2 parts per billion, because levels that low still impact children. So, thank you.
Thank you.
If I could, George, just to follow up on the doctor's comment, it really speaks to the mayor's program about getting the lead out, and the Fast Start program, and the good work that General McDaniel's doing. And it's good information saying that as you continue to monitor that over time. That's really fundamentally, as the doctor says, it's good to look at the removal of lead service lines. So thanks for your leadership on that.
Okay, so next there is schools testing, and as a result of conversations with various groups, including the Flint Technical Advisory Committee, we were encouraged to go back into the schools and have another look at what's going on in the schools. So we began a full-blown effort early in November to try and go back out to those facilities under the schools banner. There's approximately 90 facilities. And so just briefly, I want to go over the protocol that was utilized. I want to emphasize that the sample size that we use when we do schools testing is 250 mils rather than 1 liter. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, we want to raise the bar. When you use a smaller sample size, the one thing that we found in the schools is that the issues are typically right there at the fixture and the adjoining plumbing. When we've done the sequential testing, we have not seen issues. The issues that we've seen have been right there at the fixture. So we wanted to highlight that, and the way you do that is by using a smaller bottle. If we were to use a 1 liter bottle, the numbers would be significantly lower than what we found. What we did in our process was we went to these facilities and we did a flushing procedure because we did not know what kind of stagnation had taken place at some facilities. It might be on the order of months. So we wanted to flush the water to make sure there was fresh water in there. And then there was an overnight stagnation as per the lead and copper rule. Wherever possible, we took an unfiltered sample. It was not possible to have unfiltered samples at 100% of the locations in the schools simply because there were inline filters as opposed to point-of-use filters. And so that just made it impossible for us to have 100% of these being unfiltered. In my conversations with our friends at Lara, they felt that I wanted just anecdotally to know from them ballpark what percentage were unfiltered. We'll be able to, when we take a deeper dive on the data, tease that number out more accurately, but they indicated to me that approximately 70% of the samples that we took were at unfiltered locations. So I just wanted to provide those caveats there. So that there's no misrepresentation of the data. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do here is basically provide aggregated results rather than try and talk about each of these facilities. So far we've gone to 35, or I should say we have data on 35 facilities out of the 90 total. We're working on the reports for these facilities. They'll be provided to the facilities. They'll be posted online, and we're going to make sure that we provide individualized recommendations for these facilities so they know what to do at their particular facility. But when you look at the aggregated data, it looks really, really good. We've so far had 746 samples, and this was as of I believe, close of business on Wednesday, if I remember correctly. Of those, 81.2% of them were non-detect. So that's excellent news right there. 95.4%, 712 out of those 746 samples met the bottled water standard of 5 parts per billion or less. We only had 9 samples, or 1.2% of the samples, exceed 15 parts per billion. And this was at 8 different facilities. So there was one facility that had 2 of these, and then the other 7 had 1 each. Yes?
George, do you know what the cause of those is? Is it the components in the faucet, or?
Well, we're in the process of trying to nail that down for sure. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is when you say compliant with the lead-free standard, you need to use air quotes. The lead-free standard for fixtures prior to 2014 was allowing for 8% in the wetted surfaces of brass fixtures. The 2014 standard requires that an average of not exceed 0.5% of the wetted surfaces. So what that means is, number one, it still allows for 0.5%. Number two, it's an average. So if they had samples from 100 different fixtures that they tested, and I don't know how many they're required to, but it just has to be an average of less than 0.5%. So there is the possibility that you still have some lead in this brass, and it's allowed up to 0.5%. So that's why I say when you say it meets the lead-free standard, you got to use air quotes. And so the extended stagnation time will also add to that. So one of the things that we found as a result of our efforts at Freeman Elementary is as you move the water, as you incorporate flushing protocols, it creates a situation where it gets better and better and better. So these are all the factors that we're looking at. So, but even still, like I said, Out of that, we're looking at 1.2 that were above 15 parts per billion. So, as an aggregate, this data looks very, very good.
Yeah, and I agree 100%, because quite honestly, I'm
Yeah.
not going to question you, George, but because you know more about this, what are we doing then about those locations? Is that,
Well,
or what are
right
the
now,
next steps for that?
as I indicated, we'll be creating reports for each school, and we'll be contacting the schools and sharing with them some of the things that they can do. Now, understand, we're talking about typically unfiltered water here. So once you put a filter on there, you're going to be dropping it, so what we're trying to do here is say, okay, what's going on without the use of filter to the extent that we can. Stacy? So,
Excuse me, Dr. Sullivan, and we're going to have to try to move it because now we're running behind a little bit, so go ahead.
I'm just based on the data that's available regarding testing in the schools. My understanding is that the unfiltered levels pre-fixture, after the fixtures were changed, post-fixture change, without filter, the lead levels in every school exceed by a lot 15 parts per billion. After the fixture changed, the vast majority of schools did not see an improvement in lead levels. This is on the website, publicly available information. The only school that had close to an acceptable number was the School for the Deaf. Everything else was, in many cases, above 500 parts per billion in every school. So it sounds like from your aggregate data that you've gone in and done more testing, and you now have information to show that you have so many non-detects, because I didn't see that in any of the data for any of the schools after the fixture replacement. I did see it once you threw a filter on them, but not without a filter.
So, as I indicated, we're in the process of aggregating all of this data. We have yet to put the reports together. We're hoping to do that in the next couple of weeks here. As those reports are generated, we will be posting those to the web. This is all new data, so none of this is on the website just yet, but it will be very shortly.
Dr. Reynolds.
Yes, and thank you, George. We are doing things in Michigan, and specifically in Flint, that few cities, if any, are doing. But this is testing. The challenge is, how do we devise a evidence-based monitoring plan that can be broadly communicated so that parents and administrators in the schools understand how things are tested, when things are tested. They can see trend lines, because right now it's just, we're going to test now, but in a school system you have, all the breaks, you have the long summer break. How can you make sure that the first child who drinks from a water fountain is not getting a slug of lead? And that is for parents and pediatricians and family practice doctors and teachers. That is the key question.
So I'll just answer that very quickly. We are in the process of putting together that protocol. We are trying to provide guidance to schools and administrators and provide educational materials, for different classes of people, whether it be the parents and children or whoever, so that we can bring to light the things that the schools do need to do to mitigate those risks, because as Dr. Mona had indicated, even weekends, you can, that first child that comes in Monday morning, if that hasn't been flushed or if it doesn't have a filter or it hasn't been remediated, there is a risk. So that's part of the reason why we are creating this messaging. And is there anything you'd like to add to that, Rich? Or?
Several of us have a meeting with the superintendent, Tawwab, next week. I believe it's the 6th, the afternoon of the 6th. And basically what we want to talk to him about, the purpose of the meeting is to provide a data update, to also ask for his support for an intense flushing and testing process now. And we have secured some funding that we wish to talk to him about that will, if we can, it will allow for Flint to create a best-in-class or best practice protocol for schools that we would like to use across the state. We have 860 school districts out there. They all have similar problems, but they don't have the same level of awareness that we do.
I just caution you, schools that use well water have a whole different set of issues, so it never ends. But once again, thank you, George, for doing something that others have run from and will continue to run from. So thank you, and I'll be glad to see a flushing protocol that will reduce risk to an acceptable level, not just a legal level. Thanks.
Thank you.
Depew.
And really happy to hear that news, Rich, because we've been talking to the Michigan Department of Education about this, as well as others, because one of the things that we've heard from the school districts is that this added burden of making sure that they're doing all of this testing without resources would be something that they just didn't think that they could handle. So this is good news, and we hope that we can move forward with this. And this is a way of providing assurance to parents. And as Dr. Reynolds said, it's not just a one point in time data point, but to be able to show trends and to have these conversations with parents about what it is that we're doing to improve the water is great.
Thank you. George?
Okay. And this will be the last slide here. This is just a retrospective of the 90th percentile values for the LCR monitoring that has been done in the city. If you look back at January to June of 2016, it was above the 15 part per billion action level. We were at 20. And then the following monitoring period, it went down to 12. And then to speak to your concern, Dr. Mona, the past two monitoring periods have both been below the 10 part per billion that is being proposed moving forward. And bright yellow down at the bottom, because I did not want to misrepresent this, the current monitoring period is not officially closed. It closes on December 31st. That 5 number right there is based on the samples that we currently have. That number is subject to change depending on whether or not there are some samples that are added to it, or when we do our data review, because we go over this stuff with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that every sample that's in there is an appropriate sample. So we look at things such as, did the resident check the box that indicated that it was filtered? And if it was filtered water, then you got to remove it from the calculation. So that's where we stand right now. And the monitoring period does not end till the end of the month. But right now, if that were the final number, it would be at 5.
Okay, Dr. Atisha.
So now that we're replacing our lead pipes, are the samples still Tier 1 samples? So
Yes.
they are confirmed
Yeah.
lead pipe samples that this is
Yep,
coming from?
these are confirmed Tier 1 sites. They are 1 liter samples, stagnated overnight, and done strictly by the LCR protocol.
Okay, thanks. We're going to move the agenda, and if there's time at the end, we can come back to some of these questions. So, Mike, it's on you.
Thank you. I wanted to start by giving the group a brief update on what's going on with the lead and copper rules as they move through the process in Michigan. As you'll recall from past meetings, the FWICC adopted specific recommendations on how the state of Michigan could adopt lead and copper rules to be the strongest in the country. We are doing those, as I think I indicated in a prior meeting, excuse me. The meat of it will be done through a rule promulgation. So the rules have been drafted. There have been a series of public meetings on these to attempt to fine-tune the draft. based on comments from obviously this group, the governor, some subject matter stakeholders. There was a public information session on the rule set this week, Wednesday. There is a final stakeholder meeting on December 5th, and at that point, DEQ will wrap up the rule draft and submit it to the Office of Regulatory Reinvention and the Legislative Service Bureau for review. It will then go to public hearing. I still believe and hope that it will be in public hearing January, February. If we can't get it through LSB, we are on track to have it completed. Now, just so we understand, because this is being done as a rule promulgation, not a statutory change, once it goes to public hearing, the department reviews the public hearing comments. It then has to be submitted to the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, which has a period of time to review it. After the expiration of that, unless they waive that period of time, which I am embarrassed I don't remember, I believe it's 25 session days. Unless they waive that period of time, at the expiration of that period, the governor could file the rules with the Office of the Great Seal and the rules go into effect. They are largely the same as this group recommended. Through the process, there have been a couple changes that have been made. The sampling protocol tightening remains in effect to make sure there are no holes in the lead and copper rules for those looking at Mona, because this was an issue you cared about. The second draw issue, we've had many conversations about the second draw. A lot of people thought how it was drafted was too complicated, the diminishing size of the bottles. After lengthy conversations with Dr. Edwards, that has been changed to have a time-specific period rather than a bottle-specific period, but the changes are very much sort of in the weeds like that. If there's any questions on what's going on, I can fill you in. I would encourage those of you who are rule geeks like myself to watch the public hearing process. The comments that we received should be very interesting based on the comments we've received so far at the stakeholder groups. Any questions on that? Yes, Dr. Reynolds.
I'm like a dog with a bone.
Yeah.
The original lead and copper rules did not cover schools. Will the state of Michigan lead and copper rules address the issues in schools, daycare?
Two separate issues.
All right.
The lead and copper rules govern water quality testing. What we had talked about in the FWICC recommendations was to require supplemental testing at schools, daycare facilities, I believe adult foster care facilities, anything that handled fragile adults. That is not in these lead and copper rules, not because we don't want to do it, but because DEQ does not, I'm going to get real geeky on you, DEQ does not have rule promulgation authority to do that. That has to be done by a separate statute. So those bills have been drafted, but the idea is we're going to sort of do all this together, and I want the meat of it, the lead and copper rules, to be teed up first. But yeah, that is still in place. So the same thing, Dr. Reynolds, on the real estate notification bills. That too, because DEQ doesn't have rule promulgation authority to do it, has to be done by separate statute.
Any comment on PFAS? Since
Oh, you want me to do it real quick?
Real quick.
Real quick.
Yes.
PFAS. Thank you for doing it real quick while my computer just went down and I cannot there. Thank you, God. Wow. There is an issue, I just want to bring it up to this group because we've been involved in water quality, a statewide water quality issue dealing with a chemical compound, a group of chemical compounds known as PFAS, per and polyfluorinate fluoroalcohol substances. I will never say that again correctly. They are a group of chemicals that are resistant to heat, water, and oil. They have been listed by the EPA as an emerging contaminant. For us who've been working in the lead environment where there's an action level, the EPA has a lifetime health advisory that's a year old on PFCs. It is 70 parts per trillion. To sort of give a graphic on that, that is 1 drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Very difficult to detect. They bioaccumulate, which makes them difficult because they build up over time in blood and organs. There are no topical issues to them. It is an ingestion-only issue. There are 28 sites in 14 locations that we have so far confirmed the presence of PFAS in this state. To get ahead of it, the governor has issued Executive Order 2017-4, creating something called MPART, which is the Michigan PFAS, I'm not going to say it, Action Response Team, to assure sort of a comprehensive statewide approach. So there were 10 departments involved in this team, although 4 are primary: DEQ, DHS, MDARD, and DMVA. The reason DMVA is involved is a lot of Air Force and military bases are impacted by this. One of the industrial uses of PFAS in the past has been fire retardant foam. Other products, you may be Teflon, water retardants on chemicals and on shoes and clothing and carpeting. It was a chemical of widespread use. We have brought, for anybody who's ever worked with Carol Isaacs in the past, a former Chief Deputy Attorney General, a former deputy at the Department of Public Health, an emergency nurse. We have brought her out of retirement to lead the team in the statewide response. Scott Hippick is on that team. We've also retained the services of Dr. David Savitz out of Brown University to serve as a subject matter expert. This is truly an emerging contaminant, and there's not good science on it. There are conflicting scientific studies on impact, causal, action levels. It is a brave new world, and we're trying very much to be on the front of this. I would also caution you, this is a national problem. This chemical was used throughout the country. They are currently testing all military bases in the country to find the presence of these. So what you may be